This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Hague. As a fund manager and investment strategist for major institutions, George Cooper had a front row seat at the financial meltdown that nearly plunged the world into catastrophe a few years ago. He became convinced that economics is a broken science. There are many schools of thought and they all contradict each other. George figured that we had seen this kind of thing before in various scientific fields, which had all undergone what we sometimes call Copernican revolutions. He came to the conclusion that economics was ripe for a paradigm shift, and the aim of his new book is to provide that. Tim went to meet George at his home in Greenwich.
This is the Books Podcast with Tim Hague, and I'm talking to Dr. George Cooper, whose new book is Money, Blood and Revolution. It's a modest ambition you've got, George. You want to revolutionise the science of economics in one fell swoop.
Yes, it's a stretch assignment, yes.
You have, it's broad brush stuff, and which sounds terribly rude of me, but it's actually not, is it? Because you think that broad brush is the point, is what is needed at this juncture.
Yes, what I'm trying to do is point out that we've got a situation in economics where the field has broken down into lots of effectively tribal groups. They're all arguing with each other. They've all got different ideas. None of the ideas appear to be compatible. The dialogue's broken down. So what I'm trying to do with this book is to give them a new paradigm, a new framework, where we can cherry pick the best ideas from each different tribe, if you like, and get them to work together constructively.
And you have a background theory to this. You refer back to Thomas Kuhn,
yes,
and his theory of scientific revolutions, and what you're really getting at is this theory of proliferating complexity of explanations, which you suggest from Kuhn is always a sign that a science has lost its way and has failed to find a coherent explanation.
Yes, in the past, whenever you see a field starting to offer multiple different explanations for all sorts of different phenomena, and not really thinking about whether they're compatible with each other, that's when you get that's the symptoms that the science is in crisis. I wrote a passage in there about what was going on prior to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution.
Going to come to that, because this all sounds a bit dry so far, and it's not at all. And part of the reason it isn't is that you relate it to you've taken three examples of scientific revolutions, of four.
Yeah.
Four, thank you for sharing that of sort of Copernican revolutions.
Yes.
And I want you to refer back to those, because they're going to be important when we talk about your theory of circulation later on.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the four different theories that I discuss is first the very famous one, Copernicus and his revolution, when he worked out that actually the Earth was moving around the sun and not the other way around.
Turned out to be right.
He was right, yes. And the point I made with that explanation was that actually his theory, it wasn't mathematically better than the previous theories. It wasn't. It didn't help predict the movement of the stars better. All it did was provide what Kuhn called conceptual efficiency. It let people think more clearly about what they were looking at.
It was a change of perspective. It was like looking at it completely from another direction.
Yes, and that's what I'm trying to do with the circulatory theory in economics. Now, the next one, which is the one I draw on quite a lot, is William Harvey's theory of blood circulation. And that one's fascinating, actually, because that one, I think, is it's very easy to draw some lovely analogies between how he fixed the science of anatomy and how we can fix the science of economics. And then from there, I go on to Darwin's theory of evolution. And I use Darwin in two ways. One as a demonstration of how science progresses, but then the other way I bring Darwin in is to use what he discovered, which is competition, if you like, in the animal kingdom, and then say, well, let's put competition into economics rather than maximization. And there's a subtle difference between the two. Maybe we'll get to that
We
later.
will come back to that because it's absolutely crucial to the thesis.
It is. It's very important. And then the last one I use, the last science I talk about, is Alfred Wegener's description of continental drift. And that one's interesting because, again, that did in the early part of the last century, that fractured into lots of different schools of thought as well, because geologists just couldn't explain mountains, they couldn't explain oceans, they couldn't explain volcanoes or anything with their theory. And they all had different theories for little bits of it. He put the whole thing together, and again, strangely, required circulation in the theory to fix it. So that was geology was actually, again, quite a good analogy for economics.
Now, you write very entertainingly about all of those things, and that's important because it is a lively book. It is not a dry as dust tome, isn't this one? It sort of begs a question, though. If you can use these handful of scientific revolutions as ways of showing
Templates.
what's wrong with economics, is it fair to say that economics is a science? And that's I think the first question that anybody's going to want to pick up with this.
I would say right now, no, it's not. But then I make a brief comment about this at the beginning of the book. If you were looking at what we call astronomy today, pre-Copernicus, you wouldn't call that a science either. It was astrology. Similarly, the different theories about evolution, that wasn't scientific before Darwin. So right now, economics is not a science. It's a sort of chaotic mix of a few good ideas and a lot of confusion. What I'm saying with this book, which I think is it's controversial to pretty much everybody, and that is I'm saying we could turn it into a science. Now, the economists don't like it because they think it's already a science, and most of the laymen don't think it's possible because they look at economics and think that's just too chaotic. It could never be a science.
Well, we'll come on to the question of your theory of circulation in a moment when we've just dealt with the crucial, and I have to say absolutely a central matter of Star Trek and how that, because I know, which sounds funny, but it really does pin down this question of scientific revolutions as far as you're concerned. And I love the way you make it clear that only classic Star Trek will work. These kinds of analogies.
Yes, the new Star Trek films just don't work. It's got to be the original William Shatner stuff, I'm afraid.
Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. Tell me about them quickly. And then
well, the importance of that is the original Star Trek stories are all really about two different personalities. There's Spock, who is analytical and completely rational. And then there's Captain Kirk, who's sort of creative and intuitive. And a big part of what Thomas Kuhn said in his theory of scientific revolutions was that we have convinced ourselves that science progresses in the way that Spock works. So everything is rational and deductive. But we find that can lead us effectively down a cul-de-sac, can lead us to a place where the science gets stuck. And when you're stuck, that's when you need the Captain Kirk character. That's when you need somebody imaginative.
And this is you. Because actually you're not an economist. You've worked very much in finance and in the money world, but you're not you're Captain Kirk in this.
That's what I'm trying to be, yes. I'm playing the Captain Kirk role, trying to find the imaginative solution. And I'm not an economist. I've worked in finance, fund manager, and as a strategist at some of the big banks. But by training, I'm actually a physicist. So that's where I get the analogies with the science versus economics in there. But interestingly, one of the things that comes out in Kuhn's analysis of scientific revolutions is he shows that you very rarely, in fact, you never get breakthroughs, the imaginative breakthroughs
From the professional.
from the leaders of the field. And you know, for example, the best example is Alfred Wegener with the discovery of continental drift. He was actually an atmospheric scientist. He was an atmospheric physicist, and he sort of looked in on geology and went, "No, that can't work," and solved the problem sort of in passing. Similarly, Copernicus, he was working up in northern Poland. He wasn't in the mainstream of astronomy at all at the time. That was going on in Italy. So Kuhn said, you need outsiders, people that are interested in the field, obviously, but people who are not steeped in the body of knowledge as it is.
Let's start working towards a new understanding of economics. What went right 300 years ago that caused the enormous expansion of productivity and of wealth, and you know what we now think of as the norm, which for most of human history has not been?
Okay, well, I think this is actually crucial. It's crucial to the narrative of the book, and it's crucial to understanding how economies work. And it comes back to Darwin. What I say is, if we follow Darwin's logic, then humans are competitors. What worries us is our position in the social order. We want to be better than our neighbours. We want to do better than our work colleagues, if you like. Now that leads to an interesting phenomena, I think, in human society, which is that once you've got to the top of society, once you're the ruling elite, if you like, there's nobody above you to compete with. You become more worried about making sure that those beneath you don't catch up with you.
And this contradicts the neoclassical assumption that what we're trying to do is maximize our wealth, our utility. Rather than that, it's compete for. And that's really what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely. And the analogy I use a few times in the book is it's the difference between if you're watching runners race, if runners are trying to run faster than each other versus if they're just trying to run as fast as they possibly can. It's a very subtle difference, but it leads to different behaviours.
How does that lead to a different behaviour, and how does that show up in what you always describe it as a pyramid, don't you? Because there's always a lot more people at the bottom of the social order than at the top. So you've got a pyramid. What does it do within that pyramid?
Well, what it means, if I come back to it, it means that when you're at the top of the pyramid, your incentives are actually to keep the rest of the pyramid in place. You don't want them to be able to compete with you. And that's how this competitive spirit can lead to a very stagnant economy or a feudal economy, which is what I describe in the book. So what I'm saying, a good part of the book is about explaining why the Darwinian competitive instinct leads naturally to a stagnant feudal society. And this is very, very contradictory to mainstream economic thinking.
But okay, press on. What's the reverse of that?
Okay,
process?
so what?
Because there's a circulation. That's
yes, this is the point. So essentially, the message is through most of human history, we had a natural economic system, which was a feudal system, and then we had we had three quite unusual social revolutions. We had a revolution in England, or actually a pair of revolutions, which the last one was what's known as the Glorious Revolution. Then we had a revolution in America, and then we had a revolution in France. And all of those revolutions did something that hadn't happened before. They created a democratic control system. So they, as I put it, they decapitated the social pyramid, and they put in, it wasn't a great democracy to start with, but it was the start of democracy. And this had a few different effects. It broke down the rigid social structure that kept the masses in place. But it also started to create a much bigger government. And the government needed money. And the only place they could get the money from was to tax the rich. So what started to happen was that you introduced progressive taxation. So the government started taxing those at the top of the social pyramid and spending money to do things, to build roads, to build infrastructure and things like that, which employed people at the bottom of the pyramid. So we then had a situation where, if you like, the original capitalist system, the trade system, was pushing money up to the top of the pyramid, and then this new government system was then taking some of that money and putting it back into the bottom.
And there you've got your circulation, which is really the essence of your theory.
Yes. Now, and if I can bring that back now to Thomas Kuhn's theory, because what Thomas Kuhn said, and actually, if you dig into a lot of the philosophers, going right back to the Greeks, they said we make progress in our understanding when you're able to reconcile two views which appear independently correct, but in conflict with each other.
So the right approves of the capitalism, but disapproves of the taxation. The left wants to redistribute, but is disapproving of the capitalist impulse. And you wanted to bring them together and say that they work together.
That's exactly right. So what this circulatory paradigm lets me do is say, okay, now I can agree with Adam Smith. Adam Smith said the engine of economic growth is that we're all trying to do better for ourselves. I'm just twisting it a little bit and saying we're all trying to do better than each other. But basically, this model agrees with Adam Smith. But then at the other end of the spectrum, I'm saying, actually, this model also agrees with Karl Marx. This model can accept that capitalism naturally pushes wealth up to the top of the pyramid, and as Marx said, that will then effectively stagnate the economy.
You agree with everybody. You're a social democrat. No, you don't.
It's actually, it is an explanation of why centrist policies work, which they do.
Now, all of that said, Friedrich Hayek would have said early in the last century, he said something about what a democracy does is it gives the ordinary people the power to make governments do things, and the governments then spend money to satisfy the needs of, or the wants of the lower strata of the pyramid. And Hayek thought that was a bad thing. You're saying that's a good thing, but that can lead us on to actually the present situation, which is that governments have borrowed so much money to do that in response. And is that not where the biggest problem is?
It's complicated. What's really, I think, happened here is we had the circulatory system working relatively well. Capitalism was functioning quite well, and then there was the progressive taxation, which was circulating the money back down to the base of the pyramid. Then we had a few shocks to the global economy. Basically, we had a sudden increase in the working population of the world of 2 or 3 billion people when we suddenly took down the Iron Curtain and China joined the global economy. Suddenly there was an influx of very cheap workers. And that depressed the wages of Western workers. And governments effectively tried to supplement the spending power of the workers by encouraging them to borrow more and more money. So central banks, in my view, and this is actually coming back to the first book more than the second book, but central banks misunderstood what was happening when inflation started to fall, when China joined the world economy. They thought that was bad inflation. That was a sort of after 1929 flavor of inflation. But it wasn't. It wasn't a demand shock inflation. It was a supply shock inflation. Very, very different. And the central banks tried to counter this by encouraging everybody to get sort of, up to their ears in debt. If you overlay on top of that normal private sector an enormous amount of private debt, which is basically the bottom of society becoming indebted to the top of society. What that means is that a big portion of the income of the workers at the bottom goes to paying interest costs to those at the top. So they lose their spending power. The economy slows down. The people at the top get richer and richer. The people at the bottom don't have the spending power. And then we get into this strange situation, which we're in now, which is governments keep looking at the companies that have got all of the money and going, why aren't you investing? Why is the economy stalled when you've got all of this money you can clearly afford to invest? And the companies are basically saying, yes, we can afford to invest, but our customers have got no money. So it's not worth investing. So
our governments have constantly misunderstood the relation between supply and demand. I mean, this all sounds a little bit rarefied, although I think it's very clear. But you in your book, you bring it on occasion to specific things like the buy-to-let scheme.
Yes.
This business of the government saying, well, we need to get people on the housing market, so we'll let them have a bit of money to help them get there. But the problem is not the supply of people who want to buy a house. The problem is the supply of houses for them.
Yes.
Demand is there, but supply isn't. And the government's constantly making this error.
yes, and this is, again, this comes back to, I think, a very, very fundamental flaw in economic thinking. Most economic theory completely misses the banking sector, completely misses the credit sector. If you look at neoclassical economics, it's really got nothing to say about money or debt. There's no role in it. So as far as they're concerned, if you can stimulate the economy by encouraging debt, no problem, because debt isn't in their model. Whereas when you look at the Austrians, they realize that if you keep pumping debt into the system, you will create these problems. So this circulatory model allows you to integrate their banking analysis in there. And this is what I wanted to make clear at the end of the book, was if you look at so many elements of government policy over the last 3 decades, if you drill down into them, there's so many of them are about trying to engineer higher levels of debt in society, lower interest rates, student loans, buy-to-let, help to buy, the public-private finance initiatives. It's all about trying to engineer debt into the system, which has created a polarized society. It's created a society with structurally low growth. And perversely, it's actually now creating the deficits, the government deficits, because the governments have no option now other than to start borrowing in order to try to supplement demand themselves. So debt is, if you like, I'll use a strong word, it's the cancer in the system.
Okay, George, I'm going to change your name to Gideon. You're now Chancellor. Finally, what are we going to do?
Well, and this is, again, I wanted to end the book on an optimistic note because I think the problems are tractable. But you have to first understand where the problems lie, debt being a key one. Then you have to think about how to fix it. Now, what we're doing with monetary policy at the moment is the central banks are printing money to buy assets. The assets are owned by the people at the top of the social pyramid who are already rich enough, already have an excess of money, which...
True dat blood.
Yes, which they cannot find any useful. So let's, as a first cut, let's change the location of where this money from the central bank's going. Let's stop doing what's called monetary stimulus, which is trying to inflate the asset prices that are owned by those at the top. And let's switch to old-fashioned Keynesian stimulus.
I said that when this all started. I said instead of quantitative easing, let's just bring forward next year's pension rise.
Well,
because pensioners spend their money.
Well, we could do that, or fund a house building program. That will employ people. It will drive down the price of houses, which is what's necessary. And that will then put spending power into the bottom of the pyramid, both through employment and because the cost of the housing will be lower. and that will create real economic activity. And this is actually, this is just pure old-fashioned Keynesianism. So first step, redirect what the central bank is supporting. They need to support the bottom of the pyramid, not the top. The second step is get away from all of these policies that are trying to ramp up the debt level in the private sector. Student loans, you probably notice in there, that's one of my big
It's one of your bugbears. It really is.
Student loans act as a regressive taxation. They increase the tax on young people who are trying to get on the housing ladder, trying to start families, things like that. It's a terrible social structure.
And as we've learned recently, they never get paid back anyway.
Yes, exactly. So student loans, we shouldn't be doing that. The next step is we do have to recognize that there needs to be a balance between the, as I describe it, the bicep and the tricep. The bicep being the capitalist sector and the tricep being the state sector. They need to be in balance, in opposition. At the moment, the wealth polarizing force of the private sector is too strong, largely because of the debt. So we need to increase how progressive the taxation system is, which means we need to be cutting tax on those at the bottom of the social pyramid, and we need to be increasing tax on those on the top. And the easy way to do that is we should be pushing up tax on things like interest, rent, corporate profits. So we should be taxing the money earned by capital a little bit more heavily and using that to reduce the tax burden at the top. So if we organize things in the right way so that we switch from monetary stimulus to Keynesian stimulus, we rebalance the burden of taxation a little bit. And I don't think it has to be a huge amount, but it does need to be done. And then we just look at all of these government policies that are trying to ramp debt into the system and stop them. Then I think we can engineer our way out of this.
George, thank you very much. The book is Money, Blood and Revolution by George Cooper. It's £18.99 and it's published by Harriman House. George, thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
That was the Books Podcast with Tim Haig. The Books Podcast is produced by Green Shoot. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.